In today's story, we visit Chicago, where the deadliest building fire in American history took place. A disaster so large that its death toll has only been passed by New York's tragedy of September 11, 2001. Because of the graphic nature of today's story, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Welcome to Haunted Origins, where we explore the haunted history of some of the most haunted places in the world. We have a new story for you every week, so please be sure to like and subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss a story. It was a cool December day in the Windy City. Henry had just started a new position as stage manager for Chicago's beautiful Oriental Theater. Henry's day started out normal, but he was beginning to feel overwhelmed by all of the information on his first day. Deciding that he needed a break, Henry stepped out the backstage door and into the alley behind the theater. To help calm his stress, Henry reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a cigarette. Just as he was lighting it, he heard a woman's voice just over his right shoulder. "You know, smoke will kill you." Startled by this, thinking he was alone in the alley, Henry quickly turned around to address the woman. To Henry's surprise, there stood a middle-aged woman dressed in a large white hoop skirt and fancy hat. Henry was so taken aback by this woman's attire that he just stared at her. Not a word was spoken between the two, and the woman simply turned and started walking down the alley. As she was walking, she slowly vanished into the cool air. Henry was now shaking from not only the shock of what just happened, but the bitter cold in the alley. So he quickly put out his cigarette and rushed back into the theater. He didn't mention anything to his fellow crew, not wanting them to think he was crazy. He continued with his day and kept busy getting the theater ready for that evening's show. Throughout the afternoon, Henry was so busy with his work that his experience in the alley slowly began to fade from memory. The evening show went off without a hitch, and the cast and crew began to pack up and leave for the night. Henry was tasked with cleaning up and shutting down the last few items, and was one of the last members of the crew to be left before closing for the night. Henry was doing a last sweep of the back rooms when he heard a toilet flush coming from the woman's dressing rooms. Henry immediately turned in that direction because moments before, he had checked these rooms, and they were vacant. Henry started toward the bathroom to make sure nobody was still lingering when he heard the giggle of a young girl coming from the room. Thinking a child was left behind, Henry quickened his pace to make sure the child was okay. He reached the bathroom and flung the door open, and what he saw shocked him. At that moment, the sudden chill he had felt earlier that day in the alley rushed back to him. The bathroom was completely empty. Without finishing his route, Henry quickly grabbed his things and left. This wasn't Henry's last day on the job, but from that moment on, he was reluctant to go anywhere in the theater alone. This is one of many haunting stories of the now Nederland Theater in Chicago. A theater that was once called the Iroquois and was the scene of the deadliest fire in American history. A place where in a single day, 602 souls lost their lives. This is their story. Chicago, Illinois is a city rich in history. Starting as a small trading town of only 100 people in 1830, before growing into the largest city in the Midwest that it is today. Chicago has been a city full of historic achievements, some grand, and others very dark. In 1903, Chicago was on a steep rise in prominence. Fresh off the recovery from the 1871 Great Fire, Chicago was now thriving, and its residents and visitors were demanding more of life's luxuries. The latest of these was the completion of the Iroquois Theatre. Completed on November 23rd of 1903, the Iroquois was a marvel of its time, boasting some of the largest seating area capacities of any theater in town, as well as safety features that were so advanced, the theater was advertised as absolutely fireproof. Some of the key safety features were the addition of numerous exits across the north frontage allowing access, or exit, during an emergency. There were also exits for the upper levels and boxes behind the atrium that accessed fire escapes into the alley behind the theater. There were even features that were added with fire risk in mind, one being a large asbestos curtain that was deemed fireproof, along with sprinklers and an emergency fire call system. All of these features were praised leading up to its opening, and only built upon its fireproof reputation. Upon its grand opening, the theater welcomed the show Mr. Bluebeard and began ushering in guests just as the holiday season was in full swing. The morning of December 20th, 1903 began like any other. Many families and their children were enjoying the features of Chicago since it was the holiday season and the children were out of school. The Iroquois Theatre, being freshly opened, was getting ready for its largest crowd to date. The theater had a capacity of 1,704, but with the addition of standing room tickets, the sellout crowd was going to pass 2,000. As the afternoon approached, the sellout crowd began to pack in, and excitement for the show mounted. As the show began, the crew behind the scenes experienced a slight mishap with the lighting. One of the overhead lights shorted, and sparks rained down to the floor below. Unfortunately, the location of this short was right above an area where the crew were storing extra set pieces, as well as containers with paint and stain. The small fire was noticed quickly, but was building up just as quick. The crew immediately grabbed the fire extinguisher, but it was not functioning properly, and did little to stem the building blaze. Another member of the crew grabbed the asbestos curtain in an attempt to suffocate it, but the curtain snagged, and they were unable to free it. As the fire began to grow, many of the crew attempted to calm the crowd, reassuring them that there was nothing to worry about. The orchestra even continued to play, and the star of the show, Eddie Foy, came out on stage to entertain guests and ensure them that all would be just fine. What Eddie and everyone in the theater did not know was everything was not fine. Of all the safety features advertised, most of them would fail the guest of the Iroquois that day. The numerous exit doors that were such a safety benchmark for the times, they were locked in an attempt to keep unpaying guests out of the theater. Those numerous exit doors that led from the upper levels and boxes, they all led to fire escapes that had not been completed, and only led to open air and the icy alley below. On top of this, the doors all opened inward, this feature making it impossible to open if a rushing group of people were to all push toward those doors at once. Then there was the new sprinkler system that could be activated and put the fire out, that had not been hooked up and was never functional. Neither was the emergency call system that could contact the fire station immediately. With all the heralded safety features failing, what ensued was the largest fire disaster America has ever seen. As the fire continued to grow, the crowds quickly realized that escape was the only option. People began pushing toward the nearest exits, but were unable to find the doors due to lack of light or curtains hanging over them. Even if they were fortunate to find the door, they quickly found the doors locked, without any way to open them. For those who were able to find the unlocked main doors, they discovered they could not pull them open. The rushing crowd was pushing too hard for them to be pulled. As the crowd grew, pushing harder toward the exit, many people were crushed to death. Then there were those who headed toward the upper-level exits. They swung open the doors to the dark alley, not knowing that nothing was there except a fall to the icy street below. The first wave of guests immediately falling to their deaths, while the following waves only being saved by the cushioning from the bodies below. The crew members also knew they needed to escape, rushing to the backstage exits. Unfortunately, once they opened these doors, the ice-cold air from outside rushed into the theater, creating a backdraft effect, engulfing the theater even further. Another failed feature of the theater was the safety call system. Because of this, the fire department was notified so late that once they did arrive, the fire had almost burned itself out. When the fire was finally extinguished and the aftermath could be assessed, 602 people had either burned or fell to their death. While sifting through the carnage, survivors were found, being insulated from the heat and fumes under piles of the dead. In the coming days, the Marshall Fields next door lent its 8th floor to be used as a temporary hospital and morgue because of the sheer number of victims. Those responsible for the fire, the people who looked past the shortcomings to fire safety, the ones who took bribes instead of documenting violations, none of them were brought to justice. There was only one arrest made in relation to the fire, and that was the pickpocket who was looting the dead found in the alley. The Iroquois Theatre was no more, and the Colonial Theatre was put in its place. This theater was later demolished in 1925. Out of the rubble rose the Oriental Theatre, which still stands today as the Nederlander Theatre. Even with the construction of a new building, the spirits of those 602 victims are thought to still be present in the area today. The alley behind the theater has now been named Death Alley, because of the dark sensations felt by those who pass by. There are even spots within the theater that crew members will not go, because they get a cold, chilling sensation. Out of the ashes of the Iroquois came most of the safety features you see in buildings around America today. The fact that all buildings have fire exits that are easily opened outward from the inside and are well illuminated. The increase in fire inspection and code enforcement are all thanks to those that perished at the Iroquois. That will do it for today's episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please press the like button and click the link to listen to our other origin stories to some of the most haunted places. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the latest episode of Haunted Origins.